So I was just invited here to conduct the dialogue with Minister Cerda, but basically all the organization fell to Frank Vela, who put together this event very quickly. So I'm really thankful to him. So with that, Rodrigo, please, I mean, we will have a presentation by the minister, and then we will have some questions from me, from Michael in Europe, and then we will open up to questions from you. So if you have any questions, write it down, pass it to me, and I'll be consolidating them. So in the interest of time, we can put 2 or 3 together, and or through the conversation that we're having. Thanks. Let me just before that, I mean, Rodrigo's CV, it's pretty impressive. I mean, Rodrigo did his PhD in economics in the University of Chicago. When I started at the fund, he was, I think, the chief economic advisor to the minister. When I finished at the fund, he was the minister of the economy of Chile. In those 9 years, he was also the head of the budget office in Chile, and he has been in academia also for a significant period of time in very important think tanks in Chile, having, I think, a lot of impact through his research, both in Chile and Latin America. So please, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Francis, for having us here. Thank you, you all, to be here and to know a little bit about Chile. Chile is having, well, we're having elections this Sunday, first round. However, I think that Chile have had a very important shocks in the last 2 to 3 years. So I think it's interesting, maybe the Chilean experience today. Usually what happened in Chile also start to happen in other Latin American countries. So probably in that sense, it might be interesting to look at that. So I will be talking about fiscal policy, but I think that fiscal policy today depends a lot on what is happening in the society and in politics, in fact, which was not the case in the past in Chile. I think maybe in the last 30 years to 40 years, at least Minister of Finance and the ministry tried to make a very sound policies in Chile, economic policies. Usually you used to go to a Congress and you get everything approved. And in that way, we have very responsible fiscal policies and also very sound economic policies. But I think that in the last maybe 2 to 3 years, of course, what happened in Congress that we have a very polarized discussion. And of course, it has impacted a lot of what happened with the economic policies. I don't know if you have heard that we have some pension withdrawals from our funds. That has been quite important, so I will be talking a little bit about that. The pension withdrawal of those funds is not an initiative from the government, it's just an initiative from the Congress. And even though the government tried to oppose, usually, well, we have 3 laws in that terms. We just have a 4th law or project of law that was just rejected from the Congress, but it was very difficult to be rejected. Okay, so I will be talking a little bit about all those things that is happening in Chile. So probably one of the starting point of this movie, in that, if we can think of kind of a movie, is that we have a very large social unrest in Chile that in October 2019, well, we have a lot of protests and a lot of people on the street and asking, of course, for very different things that the government in some way need to react. It was, as you can see, very violent. We were not used to that. And when you see that, of course, you need to react and you need to think that, okay, this is not the same game we used to play usually. This is October 19th, and then we have the pandemic that started on 2020. I mean, just a few months later. So we have those 2 episodes that were really very important for us as society. But I think that probably one of the good thing is that Chile has some way to do it and to solve those problems. Usually we solve those problems in a democratic way. And the response of the society, the government, the Congress, and so on, was to try to solve using a discussion on our constitution. So we have democratic elections, and we start with the discussion of a new constitution that is currently underway. But I think, okay, this is an opportunity for us in the sense that if we have a good constitution, probably that means that we are going to have stable rules for the next maybe 30 to 40 years or maybe more. So in some way, I think this is the way the Chileans usually try to solve the problem. So we have a big problem in October 19, yes, but we are trying to solve it in a peaceful way, in a democratic way, and the way is just discussing that in a convention that now is working. But we were in that path, and the pandemic arrived. Okay, and the pandemic. Well, Chile is a small open economy, and such a small open economy, we usually have some economic crisis that is coming usually from outside Chile. But in that case, well, you know, this is a very big crisis. I mean, the pandemic in 2020, the GDP shrank around 6%. Yeah. Well, we didn't have those kind of numbers since maybe 1982, 1983. Okay. And so just to realize that this is a big crisis in Chile. We have economic crisis in 2009, also in 1998. Okay. But the crisis we have in 2020 was a very large crisis. So we have those two episodes that were very important. Of course, as you know, of course, also in the US, it has an impact, the economic crisis. And one of the things we decided, and maybe we decided a little later, but what we decided to do is that we start to having very large transfers for people starting in last June. Okay, this was a very large fiscal impulse, and also we have a very large fiscal transfers for almost 90% of population. So the coverage of our transfer program is around 16 million people. In Chile, we have around 18 million people. So we are talking about 85% of population, 90% of population. And the transfer are important in terms of amount, which means that program during 2021 is around 10 point of GDP, as big as that. So what you observe in terms of fiscal policy is that today, meaning 2021, we're going to have a fiscal deficit that will be around 8 points of GDP. Okay, and this is due to the program. However, we think that it was quite important to have this kind of transfer. In one way, because of course people needed to have those transfers. If we have the lockdowns, people were not allowed to work. Of course, they needed to have those income that came from the government, but also because since we have this large social unrest, of course we need to have a peaceful country, and I think that's one of the way we have accomplished that. In addition, we was one of the first countries that started with vaccination. Today we have more than 80-90% of our population that has been vaccinated. And of course, now we have in the third round of vaccination, so we're in the booster vaccination, just as here in the US. So this was also very important because now, even though we have some cases of COVID every day, but we have almost today have just a few people that is having the COVID. The COVID now and so on. Now people can go to work, and the country started to become much more normal in that sense. So people can go to work, make their life just here as in the US, and one of the result of all that, well, I'll come back to it. One of the results is that today, when we see economic activity, GDP growth for this year is expected to be around 12%, which is a very large number. Of course, we have a drop in 2020 that was 6%, but now in this year we'll be growing 12%. Okay, this is due, of course, to the transfer program we made. In that sense, we have a lot of consumption going on. Okay, we know that. Of course, this is not the sustainable growth rate of the economy, but we knew that in some way the economy and the society probably was not able to not have an increase in economic activity because we will have a lot of unemployment and so on. So we make the decision, and today, as you can see, well, in the right-hand side, my right-hand side, what you can see, the monthly economic activity is today 8% larger than it used to be at the beginning of the crisis, of both crises. So in some way, now we have accomplished our goal. That our goal was that to make growing the economy, to go back to where we needed to be. And this is a moment in which, after doing that, of course, we need to take out the fiscal impulse that we have in 2021. So just for you to know, last week I was in Congress, almost 3 weeks in Congress, and we were discussing the budget law for 2022. And the budget law for 2022, for the first time in history in Chile, I think, we will see a drop in fiscal expenditure of around 22%. Why? Because we have this very large impulse in 2021, and in 2022, we're just going back where we used to be. Okay, but this is one of the way we can do things in Chile. We can do counter-cyclical policies, and the reason we can try to do those is because when we arrived to a pandemic, we have a lot of fiscal savings that came from other administrations, and we had also very low level of fiscal debt. So, and I think this is also a very relevant thing in the sense that usually, starting in 2001, where we have a fiscal rule in which we said to the Chilean, well, in the good years, we're going to save. And we did that for a lot of years. But since 2020 and 2021 were very complicated years, that was the moment for use our fiscal policy, and we use it completely in the sense that trying to make the economy stand up again. Okay, we have accomplished that. It is the moment to go back to our fiscal responsibility starting next year, and the reason we need to go back again is because we know that we're going to have, obviously, crisis in probably, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years, we don't know. But if you go to, you see the regularity in the Chilean economy, we used to have an economic crisis in 1998, then in 2009, now in 2020. So every 10 years we're having a crisis. So we need to prepare for the next crisis. What we see is that in terms of Latin America, we're going to be one of the economies that are going to be growing much faster in 2021. What we see also is that in the last few months, the actual number of economic activity has been larger than expected in all the service we have. So in that sense, well, economic activity has been restored where it should to be. And now, of course, we need to go back to our normal policies. The problem, though, is that now we need to go back to the social unrest story. And one of the things we can look to is to the economic policy uncertainty. Well, we have some index that we compare with other countries. And what we see is that Chile, well, we still have very large number in terms of economic policy uncertainty. And this is due to the polarization we still have in Congress. And this is one of the problems we need to try to solve in the incoming month. Okay? It's not easy at all. And this is one of the reasons it's so important, the election we're going to have in this Sunday. Not just of the presidency, that of course, we're having election, but we're also having election corresponding to Congress. So I think one of the good things that has been happening maybe in the last month in Chile is that the discussion we're having in Congress is starting to be much more slower, which is one good thing, because when you have a slower discussion, well, you can have all the arguments on the table. That's one of the reasons we could reject in Congress the forced withdrawal of the pension funds, which is quite relevant. I mean, what happened in Chile is that one of the discussion is that during 2020, probably our fiscal policies was not with so much impulse and so many transfers to households, and in that way, congressmen what told us and what legislated. Okay, so in that case, well, people could use their pension funds. Okay, so that's what the idea behind the withdrawals. Of course, this is very bad policy in the sense that in the long run, well, you know, here and everywhere, the only way we could have good pensions is that you have to have some mandatory savings. And the problem is that we're withdrawing from those mandatory savings. And we have to withdraw almost 30% of all the savings we used to have. 30% is a very large number. So 30% is maybe could be decades in terms of savings. So this is, and in that sense, well, what we see is that probably it didn't happen in Chile, but today it happened, is that politics are very relevant for economic outcomes. And in that sense, well, we need to improve, of course, dialogue with the Congress, participation, and so on. Politics is quite relevant. And what we can see here, maybe the blue line here in this graph is better to see it, is that when we have this kind of policy, the withdrawal, in fact, well, since we have a 30% less of savings, it means that our capital market has shrunk. And when the capital market shrinks, well, what is happening is that people, when want to have a credit, or, I mean, they're looking for a mortgage or whatever. Well, since you have less savings, of course, well, market is going to charge you more. And what we see, well, this is the interest rate on the sovereign bond of Chile, of the government. But what we see is that, well, we used to have a very low interest rate, and now in the last few months, well, it has almost doubled. Okay, this is of course, is very bad outcome. It means that all the interest rate is very large now in Chile. If you want to get a mortgage here in the US, it's around, I don't know, 2%, 3%. Well, in Chile, it used to be almost 2% or 3% 6 months ago, and today it's around 6 to 7%. Okay. So that's one of the things we're all, of course, very worried, and that's one of the reasons we worked so hard in Congress to reject the forced pension fund withdrawal. Okay. For the moment, we were able to reject it. This is the first time in 4 projects of law we were not able, but finally we were able to reject and have to vote. So we started to think that in some way we're making very much better discussion in Congress, but okay, it takes time, and again, politics is becoming quite relevant. Another way to look to how policy uncertainty is so relevant. maybe we can look to this graph here, the one on the right. Well, what we have is in this graph is, well, is just a plot in which we have a nominal exchange rate on the y-axis, and then we have the copper price in the x-axis. Okay, usually, well, copper is very relevant in Chile. It's around 10% of total production. And what we usually see is as the copper price is becoming larger, of course, in that case, we have an income effect, and usually we have the nominal exchange rate that appreciate, okay? And these are the line that we see here. I mean, the one that one, okay? We can see different years in when we have this negative relationship, okay? But what happened is starting in the social unrest, in which we have an increase in political uncertainty, is that this relationship now has changed, and now we see this kind of relationship. What does it mean? It means basically that today, for the same copper price, nominal exchange rate is depreciated around 20%. And we can see here, I mean, those points here are 2021, in which we have all the pension fund withdrawal, in which we have a lot of political uncertainty. And in fact, copper price could increase, but we don't see any relations with nominal exchange rate. So the point is that, and this is one of the reasons we're so worried about political discussion and political uncertainty, is that, as a matter of fact, it has an impact, a clear impact, and the clear impact we see in different prices. Okay, one price is nominal exchange rate, another prices are interest rate, and of course, if the nominal exchange rate is larger, as we import so many goods from other parts of the world, of course, inflation rate is also starting to increase. And here we can see that inflation rate is starting to increase. It's not so different to other countries, but we see, again, some increase in CPI, which means that the central bank has started to increase their monetary policy. Okay, so all those things, those political discussion has impact and has impact in things that affect people. I mean, inflation rate, of course, it affects the most vulnerable. Also, interest rates and the exchange rate we have seen. We still have some way to go out of the pandemic. Here, what we can see is employment rate in Chile. Well, we used to have almost 9 million people that were employed. During the pandemic, we lost 2 million of those employments. And for the moment, we have recovered almost 1 million and 1.5 million. But we still have a way we have to recover some employment. So we expect our fiscal pulse that will remain during 2021 will allow us to converge in that sense. But of course, I mean, we're worried about that. We have some subsidies that's going directly to employment that are trying to make the convergence as fast as possible. But as you know, well, as is many parts of the world, since we have almost some technological changes, well, we don't know how much this is a structural change and how much we can recover in terms of employment. We're trying to do our best to recover as fast as possible. And here, what you can see is our balances, or fiscal balances. And well, as you can see here, this is the effective balance, and we have 2 years in which we have a very large fiscal deficit. But we just discussed the 2022 budget law, and we're expecting to go to a more normal situation in which the fiscal deficit will be around 3% of GDP. Still, it's not zero, but we're trying to make in the convergence. This is very important because if we don't do that, probably our fiscal debt that today is around 35 point of GDP, 35 point, which compared with other countries, I think still is a very good situation. Yeah. Emerging economies should be around, on average, around 70%. We're just 35%. When we entered the crisis, we entered with a fiscal debt that was around 23% of GDP, and we're getting out with 35% of GDP. It's not such a big difference. But what we realize is that if we don't close our deficit, of course, we're not going to be at 35% of GDP, but probably 60% in just a few years. That's a complete different world. So that's one of the reasons we need to make convergence as soon as possible. And well, I also told you, but this is the first time we're going to see that in 2022, fiscal expenditure is going to be lower than the previous year. Okay, and this is, well, just because, as I told you, we make the decision of having this very large countercyclical policy in 2021, but also this is the moment to normalize our fiscal policy. And as a matter of fact, what we expect is that fiscal expenditure will be around 24 point of GDP. In this year, 2021, we will have almost 32 point of GDP, but this number here is very similar to what we used to have in 2018 and 2019. So in that sense, this is just a normalization of the fiscal policy. Going forward, we still think that Chile has very good grounds. We're a very open economy. We have almost 30 free trade agreements with 66 countries. This is almost 90% of the global GDP. So in that sense, well, we still have, we're a very open economy. We still have a very good relation with different countries. And comparing with the region, we still, even though we have this social unrest, the political turmoil, and so on, well, when we compare with all countries in Latin America, in very different areas. I mean, we have the regulatory area, tax policy, labor market, infrastructure, and so on. Chile is one of the countries in which we have less risk in all those areas. And in that sense, we still think that if we can get a way out of the political crisis, probably through our constitutional convention, and throughout a much better discussion in Congress that we think that we're starting to have in the last few months, well, we think that we're still in a point in which we would have a very good economy and very good society in the incoming years. But of course, again, I think what we can see from this experience, or the Chilean experiences, is that politics is at the heart of our society, at least today, and we need to deal with that change. Okay? This is a very important change in Chile. We need to have more ways to make participation of people, to have more dialogue. This is quite relevant. Usually what the Minister of Finance said was usually a law in Chile. Well, today is not the way. Today we need to talk with people, to make the points, and to see if we have the reason or not. And if not, we need to continue working on other different topics. So in that way, well, I think that Chile has a very long way to go, but we have very good grounds. Yes, well, so this is what I wanted to show about Chile. This is a very important moment in Chile in this Sunday, but probably also next March, when we have a new Congress, will be also a very important moment in which we're going to see how the political discussion is going to be in the next 4 years in the next administration. So the composition of the Congress will be very relevant in what is going to happen in the coming years. Thank you, Alejandro. Thank you, Francis.
Hello. That was really Really interesting, amazing, and a great overview of the challenges facing Chile. And I think, many questions come to mind. I will try to put all of my questions together, so then we can turn to Michael and turn to the table here as well. And that will also give you the liberty of answering whatever you want. No, so if you get 4 questions, then you answer 2 or 3. Gives you a lot of flexibility to move through them. I think the first one is, Latin America has looked to Chile as the role model to follow. And now, one question is, hopefully we will continue to look at Chile and look for convergence of every country towards Chilean policies, GDP growth, social inclusion, etc. But I think people are asking, are we seeing a turning point in which Chile is starting to converge to Latin America? And that's something we don't want to see, but I think you frame it really well in saying, look, the problems that Latin America is facing on how to make their growth process more inclusive, their democracy more inclusive, and reflecting of the needs of sector of the population that were not considered by the political process, is being dealt in Chile through a very institutional process that, according to what you hinted, you expected to give us a model in which we will have, or we will continue to have, a market-friendly economy that continues to deliver one of the highest investment rates in Latin America, the highest growth rates in Latin America, but with much more inclusion, let's say, in education, in health, et cetera, and make the political economy equilibrium much more sustainable, and providing a much better welfare outcome for Chile's population. That would be one question: how this constitutional process, what is it going to deliver? What are the most challenging trade-offs that they have to deal with, and your expectation of how the outcome of this process is going to be. Secondly, maybe some reflections. It is hard, not sitting with the finance minister that has dealt with all the policy challenges that I imagine you went through during the pandemic, and just tell us your reflections on how the cabinet should organize yourself. How did you manage the trade-offs between health and the economy, closing down the activity, or maintaining some sector open while you implemented social distancing policies? What should be the governance? Where you have the health ministers, the economic ministers, because I'm pretty sure we didn't do it right because we didn't know how to do it. And hopefully we will have some reflections from people like you that will help everybody to do it better next time around. No? So I think that will also be extremely interesting. My third question is more technical, and it came up in your presentation. You have an economy that is 8% above where it was, let's say, beginning of 2019, before the pandemic. But you have a labor market that's still extremely weak. You're proposing a significant fiscal withdrawal that, from the point of view of what you told us, after such a large fiscal expansion, makes a lot of sense. But you have to be very careful, especially of the labor market. At the end of the day, you say, okay, if you slow down the economy after a 12% increase, and maybe with an output gap that is already close, it's the time to consolidate, but you have a labor market that is still fragile. So how are you paying attention to that? And finally, I think you gave us a very interesting natural experiment of something that sometimes Latin American politicians do not realize, of the benefits of the pension system. That, we know what are the benefits for the workers of having a replacement rate that is much higher and their funds being protected through these pension systems. But the spillovers to the rest of the economy through a market that will give you 30-year mortgages at 3%. Now we saw it. You told us that you had a decline of 30% of the assets under management, and your 10-year rate in Chile went up from 3 to 6%. That implies that mortgages are going to go up, et cetera. So I think we can point to that when we talk to policymakers in the region and say, look, this, if you look at the reverse from this, actually tells you that the pension funds are helping the middle class in Latin America to get mortgages at 3%. if we lose these pension systems, then we will go back to the 6, 7, 8% rates for long-term rates that affect investment, mortgages, etc. And I think that's a very powerful argument, and I'm pretty sure that was a winning argument in your discussions in Congress. So with that, I mean, I would be very interested in your reflections. I will be picking up, I mean, the questions from the floor, and also after that, I'll be turning it over to Michael in Brussels.
Okay. Thank you. There were many questions. I don't know if I'll remember everything, but concerning the pandemic, I think one of my first reflection is that you need to act as quick as possible. You may make mistakes, but you need to take risk. I remember that at the beginning of the pandemic, the president decided to buy a lot of vaccines that didn't exist. In fact, I mean, there were just some laboratories that were working on, and so we decided to take the risk of having those. Of course, it's a risk. I mean, if by the end you didn't have the vaccines, okay, you already have some down payment or whatever, and you could lose that. But finally, we did have the vaccines, and that make a big change in terms of what happened in Chile. Okay, and not just the vaccine, but all the health system. We need what we needed. I mean. We take the risk, we make the finance, and I think one of the things more important when you are government is that people need to be calm in some way. You need to try to say to people that things are going to be okay. In that sense, well, we need to make risk and to make decisions as fast as possible. In terms of transfers, we think that we start with transfers, but maybe but now we make a very huge program at the middle of 2021. Probably we have to those program. Maybe we could have made that decision before. Okay? But this is one of the other reasons that probably people always also you need to make again. Make calm people and that they know that they are going to be there, those transfers. We make the decision. I think that that decision has an impact on the economy. It's also very relevant. And in that sense, well, we're normalizing our fiscal policy next year. So we're going to have less impulse, of course, or a negative impulse, in fact. But what we do have in our budget is a large part of the budget that could be used directly to make large subsidies to the labor market. Okay, since it will be a new administration next year, we make as flexible as possible those funds that could be used on the labor market. So I don't know if you have seen a budget law, probably not, but usually what you have in the budget law is that you have a lot of numbers in what the numbers are, how much are you able to spend, and then each number has a text in which you said, okay, you can use that amount in this way. So probably you can use it and for those people, so you have the coverage, you have the amount, and so on. Okay, what we try to do in that case in the 2022 law is to have as flexible as possible the text, in that sense that the new administration could decide how they are going to implement the subsidy to labor market. But the point is that we make and we left a fund, a very relevant fund for the new administration, not just on the labor market, for subsidy on the labor market. We also did it for funds that could be used on small firms that also will require some help from the state. Also, we have left another fund for the COVID pandemic that also they could use the way we want. And we have left another fund that there's the usual fund that's left to a new administration that could be used on whatever they want to make to accomplish their program in the starting 3 months of their administration. So even though we have a negative impulse, what we try to do in this budget is that this budget be as flexible as possible for the administration to react. I think that's maybe one of the way to go. And coming back to pension fund withdrawals, yes, I think one of the reasons that we were able to reject, we have two chambers in Chile, the lower chamber and the Senate. We were able to reject in the Senate, not in the lower chamber. And the reason probably that we were able to reject in the Senate is because we have a lot of economic data on the table. One was the CPI. CPI in Chile is relevant. I mean, today CPI is around 6% in yearly terms. 6% is almost double what we used to have. It was around 3% in Chile. So that was one economic data was very relevant, but again, mortgages was key. Well, I already talked about mortgages in terms of interest rate are almost double, but it's not just interest rate. The other thing that happened is that we used to have a mortgage market in which you could go to the banks and ask for mortgages for 3 years of duration. Well, today, if you go to a capital market, you are just going to find for 15 years of duration. So this is another problem. I mean, of course, it's not just that people need to pay a larger interest rate, but also in very few periods. And in that way, so what happened? I mean, I have been talking with a lot of guys. One of the guys that I talked, he told me, I made the first and the second withdrawal. Okay, and what did you make it? I made it because I wanted to buy a home. So this is the first and second withdrawal was the amount of money that I will put on the table, and later I will ask for a mortgage. Okay, good. What happened? Well, the problem is that now I'm going to the market, but now even though I'm putting some money on the table, now the mortgage is so high that I'm not able to buy my house. So people is feeling what is happening with the pension fund withdrawal, with the capital market, and probably that was one of the reasons that we were able to reject. We were rejected by one vote, but we used to, in a Congress, in the Senate, where we have 44 votes. But we used to lose by, I don't know, 10 votes. So it's a very significant change. I think that in that sense, we expect we are not going to have additional withdrawals, and this 4 withdrawal, we expect to stop that one. But what we're learning is that capital market is so relevant for an economy, so relevant for middle class and for, I mean, if you're a rich one, you don't need any credit and so on. So, but if you're for the middle class, which in Chile is very large, of course you are starting to have those problems. And probably, and maybe my last reflection is that why did we have the social unrest in October 19? Well, probably one of the reasons is that as a state, we have a policy that tried to help people, but we were a very poor economy 20 years ago, and we have a policy that were focused on the poorer one. But since we start growing, what happened is that our middle class start to be also much larger, and probably we didn't change so fast our policies in the sense that we were very focused on the poorer one, but not on the middle class. And probably one of the things we need to think in the future is how we're going to accomplish that we're going to help also the middle class. And the problem we're having in Chile is that the political discussion is trying to solve all the problems today. And this is very difficult. What we used to do in Chile is that every government, of course, tackled down one problem, one social problem at a time. If you go to Bachelet 2, probably was free education for the guys that went to the universities. If you go to the government of Frei, probably was to the infrastructure in Chile. If you go to Piñera 1, was the earthquake. We have a very large earthquake. We need to rebuild Chile. So every government has solved one problem at a time. I think this. I used to think about like the Chilean way to do it things. But the social unrest, what changed is that, well, you need to solve everything and everything fast. And probably this is one of the problems we need to solve now. How we're going to solve that problem. The Constitution in that sense is a path. The Constitution, probably we're going to have a new Constitution and we're going to have more social rights. Right to, I don't know, maybe to health, to education, and so on. But the Constitution is a standard, okay? Then you need to solve in the Congress, how do you implement that? And the implementation is made through laws. And the laws, well, you can have a transition that could be very fast, or maybe you could have a transition that, well, you are going to accomplish all that, but maybe in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, I don't know. And this is second discussion we are going to have in the future. Okay? But even though I think having a new constitution and having stable rules is a very relevant thing for Chile today. Even if, well, you know, we're going to have once we have the constitution, people need to vote and will have to accept or reject the Constitution. Even if we have a rejection, I mean, we know that people have chosen something. And if we have the Constitution, well, we have this new Constitution for the next 30 for 40 years. In that sense, I think it's a great opportunity for Chile. And what we need to deal is that we need to deal on how fast is going to be the convergence, how fast we're going to accomplish all that. Okay. Probably we're going to go back to a Chilean way. I was talking about that it's more a more gradual path. Well, but these are things that people are going to solve an election, and this is the way the Chilean usually solve. I think this is a good thing of Chile. We know how to solve it. And in that sense, I think that for Latin America, in that sense, we expect also probably, I don't know if an example, but in that sense, I think if we can solve it in a democratic way in which people participate, I think that's a good way to go.
Thank you. So I think now we should turn it to Michael in Brussels.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Michael Castagnara from the Free University of Brussels at Solvay. We have a very privileged partnership with Georgetown, and I'm very happy and really honored to be part of the panel today. Minister Cerda, you gave a fantastic presentation before we started the conference itself. I checked the papers you have been writing during and after your PhD, and I was very impressed. And I think it's important, given the number of questions I have here on my screen, to remind everyone that you have been working on many different topics. You've been working on fiscal policy. You have been working on the innovation in the pharmaceutical industry. You have a paper on pension reform, which is on my screen here, but I will not show it to everyone. You have been working on the impact of economic uncertainty, on the impact of government subsidies. So you really have a broad view on the economic problems. You're now facing the immediate problems of having to tackle COVID, tackle the deficit, etc. But I would like to bring you to the longer term first, and then we can walk back to the short term. I'm seeing a number of questions about this. So the very long term will be the sustainability challenges. But we have two big problems that have been lasting for a while in Chile. One has been pointed out by Jose Dasa about the fact that for 1 decade, per capita income has not grown, productivity has not grown fast enough, and investment has even been falling. Richard Garcia is also pointing at the fact that it was one of your ambitions, or it is one of your ambitions, to address and solve economic inequality in Chile. And so I would like to bring all these questions, not as you said, you have this challenge now of having to solve everything at once. Imagine you have 20 years, 15 years, I don't know. How would you try to revive economic growth, grow the middle class, and reduce inequality?
Thank you, Michael. That's the most relevant question we have in our hands. I mean, Chile is growing in the long term. Long run trend is around 2% today. 2% for an economy like Chile, in which a population is growing around 1%, was a very, very small number. We need to be growing much faster. And one of the problems we have is that this kind of discussion that should be on the table, we are not having it. And we're not having it at all because, well, probably we're discussing all things in Congress, and I think it has passed almost 10 to 15 years in which we don't have the discussion. Probably the modernization of the state is very relevant. That would be one of the topics we should be talking about. We're trying to have some project of law in which we're trying to impulse our capital market. But again, I think the problem is that we need to have a consensus in the sense that growth rate should be a topic that is going much I mean, it's not a political topic, but it should be a country topic. And for the moment, we have not been able to do it. So probably that will be the great discussion in the coming years. And I think it will be the great discussion because today we're having our elections. Everyone is talking about increasing fiscal expenditure to have to solve social pressure, which is okay. But to do that, you need to finance that. And if not, people is not going to be happy. And after 2 to 3 years, probably one of the main discussions will be how we have more revenues and how do we grow faster. Even though we have this problem, another great problem for Chile today, and this is today, is that we're having a lot of immigration. If you go to the north of Chile, well, you're seeing a lot of people that's coming to Chile because, well, of course, we don't have we haven't solved the long run problem in Chile in terms of economic growth, but at least this year we're growing very fast. We're growing at 12% this year. And well, if you go to other countries in Latin America, well, this is not the case. So in that sense, we're having a lot of people that is trying to go to Chile. And migration in that sense, well, it's another problem that we need to tackle down. It's not easy in that sense. So migration in some ways is a problem of our success. And we're very happy that people could go to Chile and feel well in Chile. But of course, we need to provide economic opportunity for those guys and for Chileans also. And again, in the long run, the only way to do it probably is not a tax reform in which you could have some revenues in the short term. But in the long term, you need to make the country growing and growing much faster than we're doing it. So probably topics concerning modernization of the state, but also stable rules are quite relevant. And again, I'm coming back to the Constitution. Stable rules are relevant because when you make investment, and you make investment thinking in the next maybe 20 to 15 years, and this is relevant in sector like a mining sector in Chile, where you make very large investment, which last a lot of years, well, you need to have very stable rules. So in that sense, also, I think the Constitution could be, again, an opportunity, but we have a lot of discussion to make.
Be a bit provocative. You have a PhD from Chicago. Keith Fong online was asking your position compared to the Chicago Boys kind of policies. But more generally, I hear from you the need for some government intervention for this. So do you see government intervention as being mainly about redistribution? And I see a number of questions. Let me not read all of them. But do you think progress, this long run growth that you want to boost, should it come through redistribution, stronger safety nets, or stronger investment in some sectors, education? I don't know how you see the mix between the private sector and public intervention.
Yes, I think that I mean in education and human capital we have a large way to go still. I mean the quality of our public system is not as good as we would like to have it. I mean it's very different to what we have here in the US. Probably we have a much better public system in Chile. Human capital also will be one of the drivers of economic growth in the future. And in that sense, what we have done in the discussion in Chile in the last maybe 5 to 10 years, or maybe the last 5 years, is that we have put a lot of money in university, in free university, but not as much as required probably in the lower levels of education. And so in that sense, I think we have still a lot of improvement to make in education in the future. And in that sense, I'm quite sure that we need to make a lot of efforts from the public sector. Probably in terms of investment, well, of course, we also make some, we're making a lot of effort in investment in Chile also, not as, we don't have a plant like the one you have here in the US, but we're trying to make a larger investment in infrastructure and to try to boost also economic growth in the future. But again, I think we in that case we need to have some mix in which private investment continue to be important. In Chile, private investment is almost 85% of total investment. And in that sense, stable rules are becoming very relevant. So again, the constitution is relevant. In terms of redistribution, I think it's quite relevant to have a redistribution, in fact. I mean, it's relevant because one of the things we have learned with the social unrest is that people need to, or people require more redistribution. And this is also relevant for the society. So, well, we have this large program in Chile, this emergency program that started in last June. And what we have seen is a drop, at least in poverty, that according to the World Bank, maybe poverty will be in this year in Chile around 2 to 3% of population, which is much lower than we used to have 2 years ago, that was around 11% of population. Of course, that kind of program is not sustainable. I mean, it's such a large program that we are not able to have it in the long run. But probably what we have learned is that maybe more transfers to household, to some households is required in Chile, and we need to have also some space, some fiscal space to finance that. So of course, redistribution, I think, is becoming more relevant, and it's becoming more relevant because people in some way require that. I mean, society requires that. And in that sense, the government need to provide some space to do that. But again, I think probably one of the most relevant paths we have for economic growth in the future is education. Education, we need to improve and improve much more our education. We have very good education in Chile in the private sector, but the coverage of the private sector is quite few. So we need to improve and improve that. I'm not quite sure that we have put so many amount of money on universities. Probably we need now, the next step is go to lower to public education on children's, and probably this is the next step, and this is a very urgent step.
I would like to ask a last question and then pass the floor back to Alejandro. You are facing this terrible tension between growing fast and growing sustainably, which means not growing CO2. And I've checked the numbers, CO2 production, CO2 emissions in Chile have grown despite the flat GDP. I think Europe tries to be at the forefront. As you said, you have numerous trade agreements, and so trade with Europe is important. I think there is a lot of win-win to be done between the two continents. So how do you view the possibility of moving forward as a minister for one country, but also as an example for the whole region? And thank you very much for all these very interesting questions and answers.
Well, I don't know if it is an example or not, but what I'm quite sure is that we're going to learn a lot for economic and the way political arena interact with economics from these last 2 years in the incoming years. I probably this will be, I mean, when we see that poverty is decreasing from 11% to 2% in just 1 year, of course, this is not sustainable, just say this in terms of public finance, but of course we are going to learn a lot in academia, how to make transfers, how to go to people and so on. In that sense, also what we are trying to do is that we are trying to have a recovery. That's a recovery in which we are trying to look a lot to climate change and how to deal with climate change. And in that sense, we are trying to make some coalitions with the Minister of Finance in Latin America. We're trying to do it through the IDB. We're making a new platform, and we're very worried about that because, of course, we would try to grow very fast, but again, that could make a lot of damage to climate in the future. Of course, Latin America is one of the regions in which we are much poorer than other regions. But again, I think this is one of the topics we need also to try to learn. Just for you to know, one of the things we are trying to do in terms of climate change in Chile is that since we have this fiscal deficit, one type of our debt is what we call the green bonds. Green bonds are basically go to the market. I need to finance my budget. And I'm telling to investor, okay, this kind of bond is just going to be used for fiscal expenditure on climate change. For example, we can have electric buses in Chile. I need to finance that. Okay, so I have this green bond. I also want to finance more metro train lines. Metro in Santiago is also a way in which you can transport people and in which you don't have emissions or fewer emissions. So we're trying to do that, and we are having very good reception of the market. When we have this kind of emission of debt, we are usually having much lower interest rate in our debt emission. So, and this is just because of the market is trying to put the money where you can have a fixed expenditure is not making or is improving the climate. So this, I think, this is a very good lesson. And through the coalition of ministers, we are trying to expand this kind of lesson to other countries in Latin America. And we're trying to make all those efforts today. As administration, we're going to end on next March. And of course, we're going to have another minister. And that's one of the reasons we're trying to use the multilateral organisms such as the IDB or the World Bank or whatever to make those kind of efforts to be more permanent. We think this is also very relevant. But I think this is a moment in which we're going to learn a lot and for you in universities is a moment in which you can think in the country, in the world, in the next maybe 15 or 15 years, basically seeing what we have made, or maybe the mistake we made today, and also the good decision we have made. So, well, I hope we have not so many mistakes, but has been a very difficult moment for the world, but also for our country, since we have the pandemic, but also the social unrest and the polarization. I think we need to learn also how to interact the way we used to interact, at least the government with the Congress and the population, of course, has changed, and we need to know how to interact in the future. And I think we are just learning how to do it. So probably in that sense, we need to build some new institution. I'm not sure about that. That's one of the things we need to think about. But probably we need more institution. We have more participation of people. Maybe today it's not enough to have participation through the Congress, which is a very indirect way to make the participation. I'm not sure about that, but this is one of the things we need to think about, because, as I told you, stable rules are relevant, but also institutional are very relevant. And institutional are very relevant because they are the ways in which people could try to make their voice to be reached out to the authorities.
I hear an approach which is both very cautious and very ambitious. And I think that's really an example that many other governments should follow. Thank you very much, Alejandro. I give you the floor back.
Thanks, Michael. I think this is a great partnership, and I think this hybrid and dual conference work extremely well. I want to thank you, Minister Cerda, for coming here for choosing Georgetown, and maybe as a final word, you can like a quick reflection on how Chile can also continue to lead the way regarding free trade, the regional economic integration, and how to take advantage of what people have called this nearshoring, or at least a redesign of global value chains. After the pandemic, in the midst of the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing, and people are looking at Latin America and thinking, how can Latin America take advantage of this situation? So a short word on that, given the role that Chile has played. And again, thank you for a very insightful presentation that I think holds a lot of lessons for policymakers, not only in Latin America, but in other.
Before the pandemic, we were working on an agenda with some countries in the Alianza del Pacífico. We were working with Mexico, Peru, and so on, Colombia. And we were working on different agendas. One of the agendas was the integration of the capital market. Okay, and the idea was that you could make investment in Peru. You could be in Peru, and you could be making investment in Chile or in Colombia. So complete integration. I think after what happened in Chile concerning the withdrawals of the pension funds, is today much more important to have those kind of integration. The pandemic, well, one of the things the pandemic has been very difficult is that, of course, we change our priorities, but also the thing that the minister, the thing that is you are not physically with other minister making some difficulties. But again, we're starting to again try to have those kind of agenda are very relevant. Also in terms of integration, we were working in terms of energy. Energy is also another market in which we think we could integrate a lot. In Chile, we have make a lot of progress in terms of clean energy, as we have so much energy in our desert. The sun could be a really clean energy that we're starting to use, that we're also trying to integrate with the rest of Latin American countries. So I think there's a lot of integration that could come on, and probably, well, the pandemic was just a detour, but of course we are going to go back as soon as possible to that kind of agenda. We already started with the Alianza del Pacífico with some meetings, and I think if I'm not quite wrong, probably we're going to have a meeting in Colombia during the first days of January. So we're starting again with all those agendas.
And thank you very much.